So the first panel this morning reviewed the evidence on historical trends in childbirth and on who chooses home birth today. I want to look beyond the who to understand some of the whys that drive women's understandings of risk and their decisions about where to give birth. I'll do so by considering three perspectives or frameworks for understanding risk. First, the socio-cultural perception of birth in contemporary American society. Second, women's perceptions, expectations, and experiences of birth, and in particular, the ways in which some women's assessments of risk and safety differ from those of providers. And third, a structural or systems-based approach to risk. The first thing I want to note is that contemporary American culture views birth as a high-risk endeavor. The dominant cultural view of birth among medical professionals as well as among lay people sees birth as inherently risky, even dangerous. Birth is depicted in popular culture, in movies like Knocked Up, and in television shows like Birth Story, as a chaotic, bloody affair involving lots of urgency, running around, and yelling. The modal mood is one of panic. The birthing woman herself is depicted as irrational and out of control. The men around her typically seem incompetent. And when birth is depicted in a different register, it usually involves parody or humor. So to the extent that we see examples of natural or normal birth in popular culture, they're the object of ridicule, as if to say, who could imagine birth ever taking place like this? So birth is depicted as a full-blown crisis. And moreover, there are vanishingly few planned home births depicted in popular media. The only births that take place outside of the hospital, in television and the movies, are precipitous ones. So the general picture in popular culture is that no one is in charge and birth resembles nothing so much as an unmitigated disaster. Extreme pain is emphasized with no other solution in sight than drugs. So this is the culture that brought us t-shirts that read, "Biggie size my epidural." No wonder women fear birth. Yet in historical perspective, birth should seem less terrifying now than in the past. Virtually all women and babies survive birth, and the birth of a child is often an emotional high that many women and men report as being among the very happiest of their lives. How then have we come to regard birth, a natural and intrinsic part of life and human society that has been with us since the dawn of time, with such trepidation, such fear and loathing? Oops. Okay, I think the answer lies in part in a broader set of cultural shifts that have transformed modern society, the evolution of what sociologist Ulrich Beck has deemed the risk society. The central insight in Beck's theory of the risk society is that the idea of risk overshadows all of social life in modern times, and that the identification and management of risk are in fact the principal organizing forces of modern life. As Beck argues, modern society has become a risk society in the sense that it is increasingly occupied with debating, preventing, and managing risks that it itself has produced. So social organization revolves around the mitigation of risk, and according to Beck and his fellow theorist Anthony Giddens, modern life is increasingly perceived in terms of danger and organized around the pursuit of safety. So this increase in the awareness of risk leads to a pervasive sense of uncertainty, of contingency, insecurity, and anxiety that in turn leads to attempts to control the future. Now, these are multifaceted, complex theories, but I want to highlight just a few insights from theories of risk society that I think are particularly relevant when we're thinking about the assessment of risk in birth. First, many of the risks that we're most concerned with are what Beck calls manufactured risks, ones that are created by human intervention in distinction to natural risks posed by weather events, for example. Second, the omnipresence of risk in modern society leads to the emergence of a collective risk consciousness and a prevailing ethos of risk avoidance. And Beck notes that a lot of this is organized around attempting to anticipate what cannot be anticipated. Third, there's an inverse relationship between risk and trust. So science and technological expertise have become more pervasive in society at the same time that the public has lost trust in both the content and the conduct of science. And finally, the perception of risk is subjective, Beck contends. And he notes that some social actors have greater authority to define risk than others. And it's this latter aspect of risk society that leads to the development of what the anthropologist Brigitte Jordan calls authoritative knowledge. Jordan argues that in any particular domain of human life, several knowledge systems or ways of understanding the world may exist. Some of these may carry greater weight than others, either because they explain the state of the world better, or because they are associated with a stronger power base, or usually some combination of the two. As one kind of knowledge comes to dominate, other knowledge systems are delegitimated and dismissed. And what's important about authoritative knowledge is the ways in which a particular social order, which is the result of social processes, socially constructed, comes to be seen as a natural order. So we start to fail to recognize the ways in which the social order is socially constituted. In the realm of birth, obstetrics embodies authoritative knowledge and crowds out other ways of knowing and other views of birth, limiting women's awareness of alternative modes of birth. Now, risk casts a shadow that is wide, deep, and dark across much of social life in modernity, argues Beck. And indeed, many of these aspects of risk society pertain to the contemporary organization and delivery of maternity care. Ray DeVries has noted, for example, that even the attempt to classify and categorize births into varying risk levels is itself a powerful reframing of birth, one that emphasizes the pathology inherent in birth rather than the normal physiology of birth. So all of this has a powerful reframing effect to make us think of birth as dangerous. When we view birth through this lens of a risk society, we can understand better the climate of fear that surrounds American birth. And this climate of fear makes it difficult for women to approach birth in a climate of confidence. A final consequence of these ideas about birth, I would like to note, is the intense polarization of views around birth. So we often see references to two diametrically opposed models of birth. These are sometimes postulated as the medical versus the midwifery model. And you can see some of the kinds of characteristics or attributes that are associated with these two models that become very polarizing in the views of both providers and the public. But I want to note that this polarization of views about birth obscures the fact that birth is a physiological process that contains the potential for pathology. It's neither either or. And the polarization of views about birth affects cultural perceptions of risk and safety and structures the options that are available to women. So how can we situate women's assessments of risk and their individual level decision-making about birth within this wider culture of risk society and authoritative knowledge? And more importantly, how and when do women's perceptions of risk differ from those of providers, as outlined by Dr. Gregory a few minutes ago? So numerous sociological and anthropological studies of contemporary American childbirth demonstrate that women's experiences of birth are marked by a range of sometimes contradictory feelings. Women express fear. At the same time, they put a lot of emphasis on being safe or feeling safe as an important part of birth. Varying levels of trust and distrust in the female body are voiced both by women and by providers. And the desire for control is paramount in many discussions of birth. I want to focus on two of these elements of women's experience of birth in particular, control and safety, because each of these can have very different meanings and very different implications. So for some women, technology-intensive birth in the hospital imparts a desired sense of control, while for others, this same situation makes them feel out of control, that the circumstances of their birth are beyond or outside of their own control. So In a qualitative study of women's birth experiences, Nami and Lyerly document the multiple dimensions simply of control in women's accounts of birth. These range from control as a form of self-determination, to control as a feeling of personal security, to control being related to knowledge. The basic finding here is that control matters, but that what control means can vary widely among women and can have implications for their choice of birth setting. The second major theme in women's accounts is the importance of safety. So the prevailing cultural view is that the hospital is the safe place to give birth. And indeed, we know that most women trust modern medical care to ensure safe births. And yet studies show that many women who birth in hospitals end up dissatisfied with their birth experiences, and that their very high rates of routine interventions are part of the reason for their dissatisfaction. So if most women fear birth, we know that some women see birth and risk differently, and it's to this group that I turn next. Why do some women choose to birth outside of the mainstream, whether it's choosing care provided by a midwife or care outside the hospital in a home or birth center setting? I want to stress, I'm going to look at some studies about these women in just a minute, but I want to stress that for these women, the choice to birth outside the hospital is made because of their emphasis and focus on safety. It's not because they're reckless or heedless of the risks of birth. It's because their understanding of risk is very different. So a number of studies have assessed women's decision-making around home birth and have identified a set of common themes. First, we know that some women choose home birth for religious reasons. And I was particularly interested in some of the maps that Dr. McDormand showed us with high rates of home birth in Pennsylvania and Indiana, which I believe are related to the Amish populations in those two states. Yet even among women for whom religious beliefs are a primary motivation for choosing home birth, many of those women report some of the same ideas about birth that are observed among non-religious women who choose home birth. And here what we see is an emphasis on, again, control, that being at home makes the woman feel in control, an emphasis on the importance of freedom of movement, of being unrestricted, of being in a setting that offers comfort, and of recognizing that home birth entails fewer routine medical interventions. The key insight from these studies is that for the women who choose to give birth at home, they do so precisely because they feel safer at home than in the hospital. So it's historically what sent women to the hospital for birth in the first place, a desire to avoid risks and experience safer birth, seems to be what drives some women today to avoid the hospital for birth. So women who opt to birth outside of the hospital view this as the safer option, and they in fact perceive birth in the hospital setting to carry with it a set of risks. And it's precisely these risks, the risks entailed in the medicalization of birth and routine but unnecessary interventions, that these women are most concerned to, are most attentive to and most concerned about avoiding. So for them, home becomes the safer option. I want to also note the importance of trust, and this works in a variety of ways. So women who choose home birth often report that they trust in their body's ability to give birth, and they have a deep level of trust with their care provider. And trust between women and provider, we know, is related to birth outcome. But we also need to improve our understanding of the way trust among different kinds of providers is related to birth outcomes and perceptions of risk. So in the few minutes that remain, let me illustrate yet another perspective on risk, that afforded by a structural view. And Dr. Gregory gave us some great data on this a few minutes ago. I want to consider what are the systems that support or impede women's decisions about birth settings. So first I want to point out that this structural perspective on risk is typically missing from debates about home birth, but it's an important one which gives us a very different set of insights. If we focus on the lack of a systems of transport and transfers to deal with emergent situations in home birth, we can see the ways in which current institutional arrangements actually can increase the risks associated for low-risk women with birth outside of the typical setting. So numerous studies, as well as court cases, have demonstrated what Robbie Davis Floyd calls the problem with transport in the American maternity care system. We know that situations can arise during labor and delivery that necessitate a higher level of interventions than are available in home birth settings, and yet we fail to develop a system of transport and transfer that protects women and babies from adverse outcomes. And I want to note that this is not just a failure of infrastructure. This is also a problem because transfer itself is so morally fraught, in part because of these polarizations of ideas about birth and because of deep levels of distrust among provider communities. So it's not just that we don't have the infrastructure in place. It's also that we lack the cultural consensus to develop these infrastructures and ensure their smooth functioning. So another adverse effect of polarization of ideas about birth. Now, the failure to develop systems of transfer structures, the failure to develop this system structures a higher level of risk into the decision to give birth outside the hospital conventional setting than is necessary. Other societies where home birth is a viable option for women, most notably in the UK and in the Netherlands, have evolved systems to assess risk prenatally and intrapartum and to ensure the smooth transfer of women, thus reducing risk and ensuring safety for women who choose to birth outside of the hospital. So I'll conclude by outlining a few areas of research where I think social scientists in particular might contribute. First, just as there has been a social movement over the last several decades to reframe death and to develop a cultural consensus around what constitutes a good death, we need to understand what it means to have, in the words of obstetrician researcher Anne Drapkin-Lyerly, what it means to have a good birth in a variety of settings under the care of a range of providers. Second, we need better understandings of women's decision-making process and of ways to foster trust and partnerships between birthing women and among maternity care providers. And finally, we need to explore ways to change the structural landscape around birth, and especially to develop high-functioning systems of transfer, transport, and trust.
Thank you, Dr. Armstrong, for your very thoughtful and poignant talk. Next, I'd like to turn to our discussant, Dr. Catherine Menard, who is on the phone and here with us in spirit. She is the Upjohn Distinguished Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology, Vice Chair for Obstetrics, and Director of the Division of Maternal Fetal Medicine at the University of North Carolina School of Medicine. Kate,